other people coming on there then?
This meeting is being recorded.
It could be. I wanted to get started on time, so they may come in late. Is that okay with you?
That's fine.
Okay. Okay, so you can introduce yourself now if you like.
Yes, my name is Robert Gibson. I'm a staff sergeant with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in Parrystown here. Tonight we'll be talking about the Public Lands Act, work permits, and boathouses, and some of the changes that have been made to the Public Lands Act. If you want to change to the next screen there, Jennifer. So permits to work in and around water are required under the Public Lands Act. And I'll go through that tonight to explain when you need a permit and when you don't need a permit. So this applies to all Crown lands, whether and Crown or private shorelands. Next slide there, Jennifer.
Okay.
So when do you not need a permit? And this is, or when do you need a permit? So this is quite often the question we get asked, and a lot of people get confused of when they don't need when they need a permit and when they don't need a permit. And to complicate matters even further, a lot of people will get permits from the municipality, think that they are covered for the work that they're trying to do along the shorelines, and also when they're constructing stuff along the shorelines, but might find themselves getting into trouble. So when you need a permit from the ministry, from our ministry, or under the Public Lands Act, is when you are constructing a building on Crown lands, constructing a trail, water crossing, or roads on Crown lands, when you're dredging shorelines, when you're filling shorelines, when you're moving invasive or native aquatic species by mechanical means or by hands from the shorelines, and or construction or placing a structure or combination of structures that is in physical contact with more than 15 square meters of shorelines. You'll need a permit. A lot of the questions people get into is, what is shorelines? And the shorelines is basically defined as lands that is covered or seasonally inundated by water of a lake, river, stream, or ponds, and may include private, municipal, or Crown lands. So next slide there, Jennifer. Dredging shorelines. Removing crib docks could be considered dredging and requires authorization from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Materials from the base of the crib sitting on the, and this would be considered dredging if all the material is removed from that rock crib. If you're going to leave the base in the bed of the river of the lake, then there's some circumstances where you may not require a permit, and you can reconstruct your crib from that old crib base. And this will include structures on private and flooded shorelines. If you want to go to the next slide there, Jennifer. So filling of shorelands. So this is one of the common problems that we quite often will see under the Public Lands Act is individuals trying to claim more land by filling shorelands and filling in wet or marshy areas along their shorelines and trying to reclaim land and create recreational areas. And in most cases, this would not be improved. And a common example of this is individuals creating a sand beach out in front of their cottage or residence. This is something that we would have to review, and quite often those in circumstances that are feeling that we would not be approved in those circumstances there. Next slide there, Jennifer. So there's a lot of in circumstances, people claim that they're not working in the shorelands and don't require a permit. But this picture kind of illustrate what the shorelands is. And basically, in most lakes, you've got your average water level. In the spring of the year, you'll see the water levels rise up to what they call as a high water mark. And in some cases, you have situations where you may end up with potential flooding or flood zones. So in most cases, it is basically that area that is in red there that requires a work permit from the Ministry of Natural Resources in order to do work on that shorelines. Next slide there. So in certain circumstances, there is situations where you do not require a work permit, and I'll cover some of those now. So if you want to go to the next slide. So when do you don't need a work permit? So if a person applied for a dredging permit, and a dredging permit is basically when a person is trying to create a deep area beside their docks, when that permit has been approved, you can work under that previous dredging permit, and that permit is basically good for about 5 years, or good for 5 years, and you can only conduct work on the shorelines directly in front of your property there. So that's where one situation where you would not need a permit. So if you want to go to the next slide. So other situations, a person doesn't want to get into dredging, but they find that there's a bunch of boulders or maybe some debris that is beside their dock, and they can't get their boat or their sea-doo or whatever into the dock, and they just want to move the rocks of the area. So you would not require a permit under our legislation under the Public Lands Act if you move those boulders or rocks out of the area, and that's basically looking at an area that is more or less 6 meters wide, and you can clear that area, but you have to, one of the conditions you have to do is leave those boulders in the water and just move them off to the side so that you would have a clear area where you can bring the boat in. So if you start removing that stuff, then it's considered to be dredging, and then you require a dredging permit. So the area must be perpendicular to the shoreline and not exceed 6 meters in width. So next slide there, Jennifer. When a work permit is not required, so there's other situations where a work permit's not required. So some situations, people are putting in a boat lift or a railway, marine railway, to bring their boats in and out of the waters. And we don't often see the marine railways anymore, but that was a common thing years ago. When you're building a dock and you're putting on posts, piles, or stilts, or a floating dock, or a cantilever over the water, they don't require a permit from us. You can put in cribs, but there is conditions around putting in cribs, so that you can't cover a footprint that is more than 15 square meters. Or if that's 161 square feet, and you must use clean rocks and from a dry area to be used, because we don't want to be bringing in also invasive species on rocks that have been pulled from another area and then brought in and stuff like that. So you've got to be clean, dry water, rocks when you're using those rock or filling those rock cribs. Just to give you an idea of what that may look like, you would probably, well, I can cover that in another slide. I'll get into that a little bit more detail. You don't require a permit if you're removing the old docks or boathouses, but you must leave the base untouched. From the cribs, if you remove those cribs or all that cribs, you would need a dredging permit. If you're doing minor repairs to existing structure, and quite often we get calls because they see a person putting in water lines or heat loops, and they got an excavator down by the water, and they're putting in this water line. And quite often we'll get calls. You don't need a work permit for putting in a water line or intake line. And today we're talking about work around the lakes, but in other situations, minor work, road maintenance across Crown land does not need a work permit from us, but I won't get into that today. Next slide. So a lot of times people are looking, they see something and they don't know how to report it, or they, but these are some of the things that, or this is a reporting hotline that our ministry uses. It's basically the same mechanism as calling 911, but we have a TIPS hotline, and that's the hotline that is available to the public to phone in if they think they see a violation. And that's just not a violation under the Public Lands Act. That's a violation under all our resource violations, such as hunting, fishing, maybe something under the Crown for Sustainability Act, type deal. You can phone in on that 1-800 or that 1-877-847-7667 number, and that will trigger investigation to begin. And once that is triggered, then enforcement actions may be followed up on as a result of that tip that has been followed as. So in most cases, those tips remain anonymous, but it's not like phoning Crime Stopper. So just to make it clear, even if you're phoning in 911, your information does not always stay anonymous in case things do go to court. And when it does go to court, the defendant has the right to ask for disclosure, and from that disclosure we have to disclose all the information that comes in. So but when we're doing our investigations, we try to keep the information as confidential as possible, and it's only through the court process where they could access that information. So just to make that clear to anybody that's is phoning in and that stuff. So next slide there, Jennifer. So the Public Lands Act is basically an act, is an old archaic act. It's been probably around for well over 100 years. We're constantly asking them to update the Public Lands Act and its regulations. But in 2017, there was a court case that triggered the Public Lands Act to be reopened, and some changes were made as a result of that. Result of that court case. So I'll just go through some of those changes that had occurred just because of that court case, and that court case was called the Glassbell court case. And in 2017, those changes were started to be implemented. So if you want to go to the next. So previous to that, we basically operated under a policy when working around water and stuff like that. And some of these policies, basically, we call them free use policies. But under those free use policies, we had certain situations when people were working around those waters and stuff like that, that we would allow things to happen. But because of that court case, they basically said that a person can't break a policy. It has to be in legislation. So in 2017, some of those free use policies that we took for granted at one time, they started to become legislation. So previous to that, a person constructing a dock, the dock could not be more than 15 square meters. So that included the surface area on top of the dock that that would include your decking and all that stuff. So in 2017, that was amended to basically say that it can't be in physical contact with more than 15 square meters of shorelines. And now we'll get into explaining that a little bit more in detail later on in this presentation. So, one thing I'll say is some municipalities have now taken steps to control dock sizes where we don't take that those steps in controlling how big the dock can be and stuff like that anymore. It's basically we leave that up to the municipality. So municipalities may say a bylaw how long your dock can be and how wide your dock can be and stuff like that. And as long as they're not infringing on more than 15 square meters of lake bottom, then we don't get too involved in that part of how big the dock's going to be. But these are some examples of docks that don't need work permits, and these are some of the docks that we recommend that people should look at when building a new dock or looking at putting in a dock. So one is the floating docks. There's plenty of docks that companies are now making with good floating container or floating systems underneath those docks. At one time, there used to be the blue styrofoam floating floaties underneath the docks, and that is something of the past. And because of the styrofoam breaking down and going into the water, there's new materials that are now being used, and they're basically constructed out of plastic structures and stuff like that that are filled with air, and they create a lot more buoyancy and will last quite a bit longer than those old blue styrofoam blocks and stuff like that. Other types of docks, as you can see, is basically piles. Piles are driven down into the lake bottom, and then your dock is built up from that. Then there's other structures such as your steel pipes that are put on with foots on the bottom with that rest on the bottom of the water. There's cantilever docks. I don't see too much of them. Of the last two is the lift or the suspension blocks, but sometimes the lift pipes and stuff like in larger lakes such as Lake Simcoe and stuff like that, they may use systems like that to remove their docks right out of the water, so they don't have to worry about ice conditions and stuff like that. So next slide there, Jennifer. So you take a look at this picture here. It basically says or shows you a typical if a person is going to get into putting rock cribs in and stuff like that. So if you're going to do that, the crib should be at a minimum of 6 feet off the shore and should be a minimum of 6 feet apart. Cribs to the deck ratio should not exceed 50%. And this is the reason for that is we do not want to create a solid structure out there such as a pier and that if you're creating a pier that forms a groin, and what happens when you form a groin is water movement can't move along the shoreline, and you end up with situations on the backwards or the backside of the dock where the wind is not hitting, and it causes a lot of siltation or filling in on that side. So we don't want people putting in a solid structure underneath your dock all the way out. And the crib must be using clean rock and above the water mark. No pressure treated water or no pressure treated lumber in the water. And also too, you got to check on the municipalities for your setbacks from your side lot lines, and I'll explain that a little bit later in the presentation here. And we also ask you to follow timing windows when when we are putting these cribs in, because especially in the spring of the year when fish are spawning along the shorelines and stuff like that, you could be putting rock down on spawning grounds of bass and pike and other species of fish that are spawning along the shorelines. Next slide there. So part of that glass spell court case is they wanted us to define what waterfront property was and stuff like that. And previously it was a parcel of land having a boundary on the lake, river, stream, or pond. And a lot of the lakes up here, as a lot of you know, living on lakes, Manitowoc and stuff like that, there is unopened shore allowance allowing most of the lake, and that strip is usually roughly 60 feet wide, or in some areas there, and that became a little bit of a problem with some of the different situations when people were trying to put docks in or boathouses or structures on the shorelines, because that old unopened road allowance, individuals often would think that that unopened road allowance belonged to them, when in fact it did not belong to them. It belonged either to the municipality or it could have even belonged to the Crown. And when you're putting a dock or a structure up on the other side of an unopened road allowance, quite often you would require permission to do that. And we've made this a little bit easier so that individuals would be able to be in compliance, but they still had to follow some rules. And so I'll get into explaining that in the next slide here. So we want to go to the next slide, Jennifer. So previously, the picture that is on the left-hand side there kind of showed what, in a perfect world, what a property owner would typically would be allowed to do. So his property lines ran perpendicular to the shore, type deal. They followed right up to the shoreline, and from the shoreline out, for argument's sake, that became basically the Crown property. And so previously we would allow him or her to put the dock out on front of her property. So in the picture to the right there, it shows you the shore allowance or the shoreline reserve that goes around the lake. In the previous picture, if the person did not own that, really, in reality, they were supposed to ask the permission or get approvals from that shoreline owner in order to be able to do that. So what we've now changed is that open road allowance is they don't have to seek that approval anymore. They can go out, put that dock out in front of that. So that makes it clear, so that there's no issues moving forward now. So the next slide there. But with all trying to move things and trying to less complicate things, there's always a situation that crops out here. And when you're dealing with boathouses and stuff like that, you have to take this in consideration, where a person who is the waterfront owner that has a public lands behind that, there may be still some complications that come into play here. So if a person's going to put up a boathouse along the shoreline, they cannot interfere with that public right of way or that closed road allowance, because it's still, as what I said, it's still a road allowance, and whether they like it or not, a person could walk along that shoreline. If you haven't bought up that old shore allowance, they could walk behind that boathouse and right to the next door's property. So that's just the reality of the situation there. Next slide there, Jennifer. So what is a waterfront structure? A waterfront structure means a dock, a boat ramp, a boat lift, a boat port, marine railways, could include shade structures such as gazebos or canopies that is located on or affixed to a dock. Again, the person must be occupy the water front, and which would include that road allowance or that strip behind that is adjacent to the waterway there. And structures such as shades cannot be used for overnight accommodations, and you cannot charge fees for waterfront structures. And if you start charging fees, then there's another situation that comes into play that basically is left up as considered to be commercial, and you would require permits to do that. So next slide, Jennifer. Quite often we see the pictures to the left here as being a common site on Lake Manitowoc here, but that is a swim platform. We don't really get into enforcing it, but there may become a day that we could get into enforcing this. But one of the things when you are putting out a swim dock is you got to consider there's a condition there's a regulation under the Public Lands Act that it must be removed by November 1st. The reason for that is a lot of our lakes and watercourses in Parry Sound District and Muskoka districts are all controlled by dams, and if these structures are left out there and ice conditions are such, it could free those up and push them down into the dam sites, and then we end up with a fairly major issue during the runoff in the spring of the year. So that's the reason we're behind that legislation. So as it says, this is not high on our enforcement priorities, and quite often this is overlooked. So it's the same way with those solemn courses and those ski ramps or jump ramps. They also have to be removed too. So next slide there. This slide here basically talks about structures that are basically boat houses with accommodations and stuff like that. This is something that we're definitely starting to try to move away from within the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. There's just too many moving parts and too much stuff that comes back to haunt us when these things are approved, but they still are being approved in some areas. I believe that Lake Manitowoc has a bylaw basically saying that those two-story boathouses will be allowed anymore, and as we're moving forward. But as I said, these are some structures that are not we don't really get into too much in that. But saying that, there is still these out there, and as we move forward here, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So next slide there. So if you're going to get into a two-story boathouses with accommodations or with a second story above them, you must enter into a land use tenure or permit with us in order to be able to do so. In addition to that, you also must follow all of the rules and regulations set out under the Municipal Act in order to make sure that you're following their building codes and stuff like that. Just because you get a permit for us to say that you could put up a two-story boathouses does not mean you're free and clear to go ahead and put that two-story boathouses up. You have to follow all the regulations set out under the municipality and under their building permits as well. So a lot of these building permits, when they are issued, there are basically a tenure for a period of time, and most of these are issued for a 20-year period. And there is also an opportunity to buy the crown land that is directly underneath these boathouses if you don't want to get into that leasing of that land or the crown land. So, but because the leasing gets fairly expensive because it's based on the square footage of that building and they're charged accordingly. So the next slide there, Jennifer. So previously, when people were putting up two-story boathouses, they only had to pay for the only area that was considered to be a two-story boathouses. And as we go to the next slide there, Jennifer, that has now changed, and that change, if you're going to enter in an agreement with the two-story boathouses, you have to pay for all the other footprint that two-story boathouse is now attached to, and that will include a one-story boathouse to the side and any decking structure that is around that two-story boathouse. That you'd have to pay for that footprint as well. So, as I said, it's based on the square footage, and you pay by the square footage when you're leasing that type of stuff. But and you'll see quite often you'll see two-story boathouses on the big three lakes, like Lake Russell, Lake Joe, and Lake Muskoka there, where they're quite prevalent down in those areas there. Next slide there, Jennifer. So is this basically saying if you enter into these agreements and stuff like that, these tenantures must be active in good standings. If you do not continue to pay for your land use permits, what will happen is that two-story boathouses will become an unlawful occupation and will be posted as such. And once it becomes posted as an unlawful occupation, then the Crown or the ministry could take that over and charges could be laid accordingly. So the persons must keep those tenantures in good standing in order to have or maintain that boathouse. And in certain circumstances, there is a lot of people that will basically say on paper that they will go through, they'll activate these tenantures and stuff like that, and then they'll realize the costings are behind that. And also too, there's another thing that goes into two-story boathouses is basically when you're looking at your municipal taxes, you're not just based on your cottage. Now your taxes are also based on that two-story boathouses, because now that tenanture is tied to your cottage as well. So you're also paying on that two-story boathouses as part of your taxes. So the municipalities will also be looking at collecting more taxes in regards to that two-story boathouses. So the next, so commercial docks and stuff like that. Basically, if you're going to get into a situation where you're going to run marinas or you're going to charge fees and stuff like that, as I said before, you need special permissions and authorization to run commercial docks. And commercial docks is another ball of worms here, type deal in regards to how the structure is paid for, but marinas have a certain fee that they're are charged to in order to run their marinas, and they have to pay for the docks and what footprint those docks are covering as part of the marina dock fees and stuff like that. So next slide there. So if you're looking at getting into maybe looking at wanting to get into getting a work permit and stuff like that, these are some of the websites that if you want to take a moment and copy those down, or maybe Jennifer could share that presentation so that you have those websites. But to contact the Ministry of Natural Resources through our website is the top one there. For more information about Crown Land, there's another website there. To getting information about work permits or applying for work permits, there's the second work things there. And if you need some more clarifications under the Public Lands Act, there's the e-laws at the bottom there. So next slide, Jennifer. And that's it. So I don't know who's on and may want to ask questions, but I'm willing to stay on and answer any questions that a person's may be wanting to ask of me. So.
Okay, I have a question, Rob. In terms of, you mentioned that sometimes people are trying to sort of add to their property by putting in fill or rocks or sand, and that's not allowed. Have there been any instances where you've asked people to reverse the work that they've done? Or
so under the Public Lands Act, what it does is it triggers an investigation. And when an investigation is triggered, we send public land staff out. Public lands our staff will do an inspection of what has occurred. And sometimes we'll have to look into seeing whether permits have been issued or not for that work that has been done. So if there's been no permits issued for the work that has been done, then that basically falls back over to enforcement. So we would take an enforcement action at that time. We would investigate it fully. And once it's investigated fully, charges could be laid. And once charges are laid and it goes to court, we will ask for what they call a restitution order or a removal order. And that removal order may require that person to remove any of that material that was put in there that was not authorized to be put in there, and to restore the shoreline back to its natural condition.
so to restore the shoreline, that might mean replanting some of the vegetation. And
so we have to be careful on that. We're basically we will be looking at the shoreline itself. So anything from what I showed in that one picture there, kind of showing the high water mark or what we consider to be lands that would be inundated, flooded. That would be from that point down, we would ask for restoration in that area there. So above that mark there, that it would be considered to be private land, and the courts would not allow us to put the court order onto the private land, only onto the lands affected by the Public Lands Act. So yes, if there was trees or vegetation to stabilize that bank, then that may be part of that process, and we would rely on our lands technicians to provide that input when we're looking at restoring that land area.
okay, I have another couple of questions, but does anybody else have a question? You can just unmute yourself and go ahead and talk. I'm not seeing anyone or hearing anyone. So you talked about removing rocks that are within a 15 square meter area beside the dock, as long as you just move them and keep them in the same area. What about tree stumps and that kind of thing? If you have a tree stump, are you allowed to take that out, or do you need to build around that?
No, so in that area there, with as long as it's a perpendicular to the shore and within 6 meters from the side of your dock, you can remove the old stump. But the thing with the old stump and stuff like that, a lot of times they're waterlogged and whatever. We're just asking them to be moved over or moved to the side. We're more concerned about just leaving the stones in those situations, but if the person happened to remove the fallen log or whatever completely out of the water, is it a violation? Technically it is, but are we going to enforce it? I would have to say no, that we probably wouldn't enforce the removal of that log or that or those branches, I guess. So.
Okay,
Does that help you, Jennifer?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I just had one more question. You talked about your identity being revealed for Crown land violations if a case goes to court. Does that also include if someone would, for example, report somebody violating regulations on their private property? It's anonymous, but it would get revealed if it goes to court, or?
Yeah, so like if you phone in, so quite often when we have people phone into the tips line, and even when people phone into the OPP on the 911 line, they quite often will say that I want to remain anonymous. So they'll be directed by the caller to hang up and ask to call Crime Stopper if they want to remain completely anonymously. But all I was saying that if a violation occurs and a person wants to report it, that we'll do whatever we can to protect their identity. But if it goes to court, let's say a person shoots a deer on your private property, type deal, or the person shoots a deer on their own private property out of season and they get caught for them, and somebody phones in about that. In those situations there, again, like as I said, we'll try to leave the person's name out of it. We'll investigate it fully, and through disclosure, if their lawyer asks for full disclosure of those information, unless the person enters in as a confidential informant, we have no other choice but to basically give them over as a witness, and basically saying that they're going to be a witness in our investigation. So.
Okay. Good. Are there any other questions coming in, or? No, that sounds like that's all. So I just had a question too about tree removal. I know McKellar doesn't have a bylaw governing the removal or leaving in trees, but are there areas that you work in that do have those bylaws, and do you get involved at all, or? So
typically in Southern Ontario, there is bylaws that are put out by the municipality of a tree cutting bylaw on private lands. A lot in Northern Ontario and stuff like that. There is other legislations such as the Crown Lands for Sustainability Act, but that only applies to trees on Crown land, where a person has to follow certain conditions when cutting trees and stuff like that. When it comes to private land along shorelands right now, there is a few municipalities that are now entertaining some of those bylaws and trying to enact them. But as you alluded to, like McKellar does not have any things in that. I have known some lake associations, not being it's an act or a bylaw, but they encourage people not to cut along the shorelines and try to preserve the shorelines, you know, type deal through their through education or promotions, you know, type deal, and it works quite well, you know, type deal. Some of those cottage associations have a strong voice, and they will educate people, and a lot of people will listen to it and start trying to do the right things about the shorelines, so that they try to stay natural and as long as possible. One thing, as I said before in my presentation, it's just not only Lake Manitowoc, but a lot of the lakes. There is what they call the shoreline road allowance around the outside. So one thing a municipality could do is basically entertain the idea, and would be if that shoreline is owned by the municipality, is that they ask permission to cut trees within that zone as well too. So that's something that could be thought about or entertained moving forward and stuff like that.
So the shoreline road allowance goes all around the perimeter of the lake, a certain width, and
yeah,
that,
most of it's 66 feet there, Jennifer. But sometimes, in some circumstances, that 66-foot road allowance goes out into the water, you know, type deal, and sometimes it goes back on the land. So it's not always, but it's there generally around the lake, and there's certain circumstances where people have bought up that 66-foot road allowance right to the shoreline, you know, type deal, so that they have ownership right to the shoreline. So, but needless to say, that is something that could be considered or brought forward, you know, if you were looking to try to preserve or protect some of the shorelines.
so that if somebody was buying up that road allowance, they would probably go to the township to do that, or is that Crown land?
Depending on how it's designated. So most of the shoreline road allowance around lake are, so you'd have to get into Google. We use Geo Warehouse to be able to determine the ownership of the shorelines, but there is certain ones that the municipality did take over, and then there's other ones that the municipality didn't take over, and yeah, around Lake Manitowoc. So it's a little bit of a dog's breakfast, to say the least, I guess. So.
Yeah. Well, this has been really interesting. It's good that all these protections are in place to keep the lake quality and the water quality in such a condition that it's healthy and we can all enjoy it. And we really appreciate the role that you play in this, Rob.
We also appreciate the role that the cottage associations play in as well, you know, take deal, or the stewardship committees and stuff like that play in as well, because we can only be out in the landscape a certain amount, and through these cottage associations or these stewardship committees and stuff like that, they become our eyes and ears, and they also become our advocate, you know, type deal, to try to preserve or protect those areas as well. So we appreciate the work that you do as well. So.
Good, and thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.